Howdy everyone, welcome to another episode of Devlogs. This week, I have been messing with the demo level scene you saw in the last video. While the footage shows off the scene, I want to break down what this is for a bit more. My Advanced Topics in Game Design class is doing a 3-year project on gamification. This is a term that has been ever evolving and has been a hot topic during my class discussions. Gamification, as the internet says, is the application of typical elements of game playing to other areas of activity. Now this is a pretty surface level definition, which is something I've read about and discussed in class. To throw a few research papers and names out there, there's Games with a Purpose by Vonahn Dabbish, Defining Gamification by Deterding, and Making Learning Fun by Malone and Lepper. Sorry if I mispronounced those. If you're really interested in these, I'll link the papers in the description. The reason I am mentioning them is to first talk about how I am applying gamification to this game. Firstly, I see this game as an educational tool, which is an important distinction to make. If the Unity project were simply a video game, I would incorporate elements into it that are solely for entertainment. However, that is not the goal, as you can see in the title slide of this presentation. Clipmaster is intended to be an educational video game demonstrating acoustical absorption. I mentioned this project took slight inspiration off of my acoustics class, which here is how that is. How a sound reflects or is absorbed in a recording environment is important for someone in a studio, a theater, an isolation booth, or a practice room for a musician. The shape of a room, the objects within, and the textures of surfaces all affect how sound is reflected and absorbed. By the time sound reaches someone, how you perceive that sound will be heavily influenced by the acoustics of the environment. This is something I want the player to audibly learn, through the lens of a puzzle game. This is also where gamification comes in, because what I'm doing is applying elements of a puzzle game to an educational experience, or for better terms, gamifying an educational tool. This is an old top-down concept for the level design of a demo level. The only difference is that instead of a boombox, we have a radio that plays music. There are some hurdles I am experiencing with making sure I properly define an environment with the proper acoustics, and am able to feed proper information to the player, both audibly and visually, but I am simply taking things one step at a time while aiming to implement as many of Wise's tools I know of and would seem useful. Now, I mentioned puzzle games, which the elements I plan to take from such a genre are just a few things. For one, a ranking system will provide the player with performance-based feedback. This is an intrinsic motivator, because having such feedback at the end of a level is what creates a puzzle genre charm. Such a charm is fun for players, more so specific types of players. The 4 player types I will reference come from a research paper by Bartle that proposes these player types. They are as follows: killers, achievers, explorers, and socializers. Feel free to read this paper, linked in the description. I simply want to pinpoint the player types I've aimed to appeal to and how I am doing this. To start, let's elaborate on the gameplay and what makes it a so-called puzzle game. Look at footage of the level as I explain this. Imagine you, the player, spawning in the middle of this room in VR. You cannot move from your spawn point in the game, though you can interact and modify objects from a long distance, point-and-click interaction. There are plaster walls, a wood floor, a concrete ceiling, and a desk with a radio on top playing music. What makes this more than a scene are your hands. At first, I wanted to use an oscilloscope, but I've changed my mind, so bear with me. At the start of every level, the music will be playing too loud. How you know this is by your hands. In substitution of an oscilloscope, I want to visually tell the player that the music is too loud by their hands turning red. The color of their hands can change by interacting with the scene, and this is where it becomes a puzzle game. By rotating the radio, moving it towards or away from you, adding or removing objects, changing the materials of surfaces, the acoustics of your room will be affected, changing how you perceive levels from your fixed position. Having the player in a fixed position is what prevents this from becoming a sandbox rather than a puzzle game, because it is one constant that is guaranteed and has to be taken into account each level. Despite that, the player will have full reign over their environment and not feel bound by that constraint. So with the mechanics of the game in mind, what is the objective? Using a UI in a fashion I haven't decided, I want to instruct the player to fix the decibel levels of the music. When the player feels the levels are balanced, there will be a submit button they can click, leading to the end of the level and the player receiving a rank based on 3 components. These components are also undecided, but I gave 3 examples in my early presentation of the game. Completing the level in X amount of time, the average hearing level of the player being between 60 to 80 decibels, and the average hearing level being the golden standard, 70 to 75 decibels. These were levels I found consistently recommended by professionals online. Anything above can lead to hearing damage after prolonged exposure. So what this puzzle game is doing is training the player's ear to identify what the golden standard for listening to music is by interacting with the environment in puzzle-like scenarios. Of course, for all of this to work, I'd need to understand how the shape of a room, materials of objects and their placement, as well as orientation, can affect the acoustics of an environment, and then consider how this all translates into Unity. This is a lot, and realistically, not something I will fully achieve by the end of the semester. However, what matters is the concept and getting to a point where my scene becomes play testable, because right now, you simply hit play mode and chiptune music plays, and that's not ideal. So for today, I'm going to focus on the visual feedback of decibel levels, referencing this video I found on driving visuals from volume output. The goal this week is to make it so when music is playing, the player's hands will change color depending on the decibel levels. Here's how I did this after watching the video. We need to reference the decibel levels and connect these levels to a real-time parameter control. The RTPC can reference all values within the Wwise meter, and based on the decibel level given in the meter, we can reference that value with a Wwise type property. After doing this, we will create a function that changes the color of a material on the player's hands based on what levels the meter is reaching. Let's see what this looks like. So in this snippet, we have two public properties being referenced. The RTPC value mimicking the decibel range on the Wwise meter, and a material property to reference the material we're using for the hands game objects. The music plays, and you can see the color changing whenever the Wwise meter hits a range from 0 to 16 decibels. 48 is the max range I could have set, but I felt the changing color was easier to notice with this value. No matter the value you choose, you just have to make sure you divide it by itself. Here's the problem you may miss though. When I drag the radio to and from the listener and the music gets louder or disappears, the colors are still changing even when there is no music present. This means Wwise is listening to the music and referencing its levels at all times, which is what we aim to do. However, this brings up a problem. What we want is for the levels the listener is hearing to be monitored, and for what levels the listener is hearing to affect the changing color of the player's hands. This means we need a real-time parameter control to reference something other than the Wwise meter for the song, because the levels of the sound do not matter. What matters is the levels the listener hears the song at, which accounts for the effects applied to the song from the acoustics of the level, before the music even reaches the player. This is a question for next week's episode, which I am hoping gets answered by the video you see here. What value range do I need to create an RTPC for that can account for levels the listener is hearing music at, and for those levels to determine the color of their hands? On the bright side, we can reuse this script for changing the hand color. All that will change in the script is the RTPC properties in Wwise and the game object this function is applied to, which I anticipate being the camera game object with our listener component. That's all for now though. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.